Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this morning, this special speaker event workshop. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. I am Nicole Copens, the Hurlbut Elementary School PTO president. I will turn it on to Daniela Swetland.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and also thanks for coming this morning. I'm the PTO president at WIS. I would like to thank Mrs. Falber for joining us this morning. I also would like to thank our two Board of Ed members, Taffy Miller and Melissa Walker, for also joining us today. I'll pass it back to Mindy. I'm sorry, not Mindy, I'm sorry, excuse me. Morning coffee. I'll pass it back to Nicole.
I want to also acknowledge Ruby Hedge, another Board of Ed rep who has just joined us. And thank you for attending as well. We'll pass it on to Mrs. Cadis, the principal of Hurlbut Elementary School.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this morning. I'm so happy to see all of you here for this important speaker. I might be the only principal on yet. I know people are coming from other meetings, but oh, there's Patty Falber. Patty Falber from West. So I'm Laura Cadis, the principal of the elementary school pre-K to 2. Patty Falber is also with us. She's the principal of the intermediate school, grades 3 to 5. Dan Doak, our principal at the middle school, and Lisa Wallach at the high school. And just to let everyone know too, as leaders in the district, we are doing a book study this year with our curriculum instructional leaders, led by Dr. Craw out of central office on the book Unconscious Bias in Schools. So it is certainly an important topic, near and dear to all of us, and certainly an area where I think the work is never done. But we're excited to join in this conversation today and to help keep the conversations and the work moving along.
We have our special parent here, and also he is on the Western Diversity and Inclusion Committee, Martin Mahabir. So we will ask him to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about this committee.
Martin being special, I don't even know if that's ever been acknowledged. Definitely not in my own household. But anyway, I don't know. There's so many people on here. I want to give a nod to Jillian, who's the chair of the Western DEI, and Shara, who is the founder of Team Western. They're both doing a lot of work in this space. You know, we're living in some challenging times, and there have been some historic events that have occurred over the last year that has really exposed, I think, you know, systemic racism and inequities. And what I am seeing, though, is that there are some who still don't want to talk about it. And, you know, if we want what someone recently put it to have stellar 21st century kids, we have to be intentional, I think, about how we help them develop their cross-cultural skills, and both cognitive skills and experiences. So I believe one of the surest ways that we can do that as parents are, one, we've got to be willing to talk about racial inequities and the social justice in our households. We can't shy away from those conversations. They're teaching moments. And, you know, our kids, they see color and they see differences. And I actually think that's a good thing. And secondly, I think we have to support our teachers to help them have those similar conversations. So they're challenging times, but there are also some exciting times. You know, there are some courageous conversations going on in our community here. I hope we can have similar courageous conversations here today. I'm grateful to Dr. Reynolds for being here to help us with the language to discuss race and examine our own biases and microaggressions, and you know, that space of you don't know what you don't know. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Reynolds.
Thank you, Martin. And we'll pass it back on to Mrs. Cadis.
Thank you, Nicole. We were so excited when Nicole shared that she was able to have Dr. Reynolds join us today. We're really honored to have you with us and excited to have you share your experiences with us and to help us move these conversations in the direction they need to go. Dr. Jonelle Reynolds is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives at the University of Connecticut. Welcome, Dr. Reynolds, and I'm going to turn the platform over to you now.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Oh, I can't see you.
Yes.
Okay. I just realized that I can't see you. So if you see me looking slightly to the left, I have another laptop where I have all of my notes. In the chat, Nicole, can you share the link again? That's where all of the reference materials from the activities to the handouts, everything will be there. So it's a lot easier for you to sort of manage. We're not going to go through everything in terms of the handouts. That is, I mean, I would rather you focus a little bit more on what we're talking about, but know that you have the reference for, you know, review at your own time and pace. Okay, so let's get into it. So thank you all for having me here. Again, I'm Jonelle Reynolds. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives here at UConn. Okay. So today we're going to learn or pay attention to some of the outcomes, increasing your awareness of your own identities, understanding the sources of unconscious bias and how bias can influence the interactions, your interactions with others. You'll be able to examine the presence and impact that microaggressions can have on our communication, and then ultimately develop strategies to combat bias. So again, my background, I think most people generally like to hear the educational part to make sure that I'm a credible source. So my background, my bachelor's is in business journalism and communications. I lived in New York for 7 years, went to Brewer College. Then I moved to Oklahoma and did my master's in marriage and family therapy with a focus on the populations I focused on were victims and perpetrators of domestic violence and sexual assault. Then I moved to Connecticut, at the University of Connecticut, to do my PhD in human development and family sciences with a specialization in parenthood and parent-child relationships. My clinical work, once I moved to Connecticut, had more to do with college level students and parents who were in the process of getting divorced. So I did a lot of those mandatory classes for parents. All right, so that's some of like my educational background. And I thought, since I asked all of you to do the homework where you would be sharing your identity and you did the pie charts, that I would do the same for you. It's hard to ask other people to be vulnerable and share personal stuff if I'm not willing to do it with all of you. So I decided to focus on 2 of the pie charts, my own perception of my identity or the salient identity traits, and then how others perceive me. So I am Christian, and that plays a huge part in terms of how I see the world, the values that I hold dear and true. And as a marriage and family therapist, my clinical training aligns very well with the values that I have as a Christian person, a Christian woman. And those play a huge role in terms of the job that I do, in terms of having difficult conversations, interacting with people of all different cultural backgrounds and beliefs that align or may not align with my own. And that's usually what helps me to navigate the professional world. But there are times my Guyanese culture, so I'm originally from Guyana in South America. I moved here at 21. So my Guyanese culture is very deep rooted in who I am as a person. And for those who have interacted with women from the Caribbean, we tend to be spicy and sassy and have an opinion on a lot of things. And we also tend to be very animated in the way that we deal with everything. And so many times, right, the Guyanese woman in me wants to emerge, but that is not always appropriate when there's conflict that I'm trying to resolve, whether it's between faculty and students or between students, etc. And then the other part that I would say that plays a huge sort of, and I'm sure you've heard me say woman multiple times, being a woman also plays a huge part in how I show up in the world. You know, but then, you know, as I tend to navigate predominantly white spaces, University of Connecticut is a predominantly white space. In fact, Connecticut is predominantly white. So I would say this reflects how I show up. And because of my skin color, oftentimes when I show up in spaces, that's the first thing that people see. and whatever connotations people that I'm interacting with have about Black people, that's what's going to emerge to the surface, whether it's positive or negative. And then secondly, when they see me, it's just not Black, but then a Black woman. Again, there's lots of connotations for better or worse. And many of those connotations have to do with whether or not you've ever met a Black woman, whether or not you have had positive experiences, where are your sources of information, and how that is impacting what sort of expectations you have of me just on site, right? However, when I'm in academic spaces, particularly in, higher ed sort of spaces, having a PhD elevates my credibility, elevates the way that people see me. All of a sudden, adding PhD to my name, there were people who suddenly were open to what I had to say before. So there's some elite sort of connotations that come with PhDs. All of a sudden, I am a know-it-all or a specialist, but really I'm a specialist in a very particular niche area. And then once I start talking, then, I find that when I'm having very positive emotions or negative emotions, either of those extremes, my accent tends to come out. And so when people hear the accent, especially if I haven't warned them, automatically I get put in that foreigner box. So there might be curiosity, there might be whatever, right? Connotations that individuals will have. So if you pay attention to how others see me and what they are prioritizing in terms of how I walk and how I navigate the world, it doesn't necessarily line up with how I see it, right? The only things that we have in the two pie charts have in common is that I'm a woman. But the invisible, like you wouldn't know I'm Christian by just looking at me. I generally do not wear any type of jewelry and so on that says what religious group I belong to. I also don't have like the Guyanese flag in my car or any of those things that some Caribbean folk do. So a lot of it is invisible unless I tend to show you. And so one of the reasons why it's so important to build relationships and get to know people and expose yourself to people from different backgrounds, it helps you when you are meeting new people who do not look like you or have differences, that you're not just coming with a negative lens. So with that in mind, I think I need to stop sharing. All right. So if you came in while I was talking, the link in the chat is where you'll find all of the materials. So, okay. I hope most of you did the homework, at least looked at it, thought about it. I'm thinking in terms of, like how I shared with my pie chart. I hope that will help you to be able to do the activity. There were 2 questions that you really have to think about. So, you pick either the pie chart that had to do with how you see yourself, or the one that has to do with how other people see you. Pick one of those, the largest one, and you're answering these questions. How does this aspect, right, the largest slice of your identity, impact how you speak with your children about diversity and inclusion? And then how does this aspect of your identity inform whether you feel included in this community, meaning, your PTO, the school community, your relationship with the teachers, with the other parents, that are sort of like your peers. So how does this aspect, and of course, like for myself, right, I had 2 slices that were very similar in size, so you could probably have intersectionality of those. So you're thinking about how does that identity or intersection of identities inform whether you feel included within that community, within your community, and then also how does that identity or identities inform how others who are different from you feel included, right? So you're thinking about how your community creates space for you to be a part of it, and then for yourself, how what is your contribution to people who are different from you feeling included? So let's see, we have 69 people. So I'm going to put you into groups, and in your groups, Nicole, what is that you shared? That looks like the Zoom link. So for anyone who has not seen the link in the chat, that's the link to see everything, including the questions. If there are 60 something people, let's do groups of
again. Sorry.
11.
It's actually,
yeah. So I just put the link in the chat. I'm going to put you into groups,
over.
And in your groups, you're going to discuss those 2 questions, right? Just share as much or as little, but it will be helpful if you can, because it's helpful to hear what other people are sharing. Okay.
How do they get into the groups? Do they just click to join?
Mm-hmm.
So each group, one person will be basically the can kind of just start their question or the discussion, and then we will regroup again to continue with Jonelle. On the screen, it says broadcast message to all.
I know, but it's not letting me do all of the questions all at once.
Okay. How does this aspect of your identity impact how you speak with your children about diversity and inclusion?
Only the people that are in the main room can hear you.
Okay.
How you feel included?
Hi.
Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Nicole.
Hi.
Sorry, Jenny.
The link. I wonder if anyone can send me the link through email so I can see it, because I'm not sure.
I can do that, Gail.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura. I don't know how to do that.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I guess I would just say that as far as like, for me, I'm a social worker, so I pretty much, it impacts every conversation I have with my kids. And I'm on this call because I'm a social worker and I was interested in what was going to happen today. And we're doing lots of initiatives at my agency that I work at. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about the unconscious bias and just kind of get an understanding of what's going on in our school system. So I'm not sure that as a parent and as a social worker, I think we're always touching on race and gender and all sorts of things in my house.
I've always had 2 jobs, but my day job was, I'm actually at home now with children very late in life, but my day job was as a social worker also.
Okay.
So I worked in mental health with children who had learning disabilities or some form of mental illness, but also exhibited challenging behaviors. And I was head of a community team after many years working in a hospital. I worked in a community team where we placed people out in the community. And predominantly I was working in rural Wales, part of rural Wales in Liverpool. So we had a very mixed.
Hi, Judith, this is Michelle. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
How are you? Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi. My dogs heard your dogs, and now they're running around the house.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that there was homework involved, and I'm not quite prepared for the group.
I know, now we know.
But that's okay. That's okay. It's just basically a small discussion about how would you talk to your kids about diversity and how do you, so it's not really hard homework.
Okay.
Yes.
So I just started thinking about it now that she was discussing the assignment, and I kind of felt I'm probably a poor choice because since moving to Weston, I've had a hard time making connections, and so you know, and I'm constantly encouraging my kids too, but it's been a bit hard. And so, and I also think maybe it's my age now that I've turned 50 and such, that I kind of make smaller attempts. So it's kind of my own fault. But through the years, being an immigrant myself, and you know, being kind of the outlier, I've had, I think, very interesting groups of friends. So I think I tend to gravitate towards the more interesting, more unique people in a group. So I think that might influence my children a bit. What I find interesting, and I think my children are a little bit more like me in that. I hope, I'm not sure, that they do, instead of trying to fit in, just try and be themselves. But it's stages. There's stages to it, I guess. I'm not sure if that answers the question. But I think I'm always trying to at least teach my children to see the world through other people's eyes and other points of view instead of just their own.
This is Michelle. Can you hear me, Judith?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I don't know if anyone else is with us or it's just us. I haven't seen. I really appreciate what you said. I'm an older mom. I'm 53. I have a 7th and a 5th.
How did I get back to you? Is the breakout room going to be broken up, close, and everyone will rejoin shortly?
Well, I accidentally clicked close, so I thought it would. It usually takes a minute, but I guess it didn't. So, okay.
Here it is coming back. Hi.
Okay, it looks like people are back. All right, so who wants to volunteer to share out some of your discussion? Excuse me, what came up for you in terms of how does this aspect, you know, so if you're sharing, say, what aspect of your identity and how it impacts the way you speak to your children about diversity and inclusion, or what were some of the themes that came up in your discussion?
So I think that some of the themes that came up in our discussion was just that the people in the room, you know, want to be here, you know, and that we're interested in the conversation and we're having conversations in our house with our families.
Mm-hmm.
You know, me and another person in the group were social workers. I'm a social worker. And so that's my interest anyway. And so, you know, I think it was nice to be with a group of people who are interested in having this conversation, this very important conversation. So.
Thank you, Gail. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Dominique.
Hi, Dominique.
Yeah, we touched on a couple of things, one of which was one of the participants, I'm sorry, I forget who it was, but it wasn't me, but because I don't have a job, but she's an attorney and a female, and how she had to prove in the workplace how, no, I'm not just on the mommy track, right? Like you have to push through that. That's part of being a female in the workplace, which, we're definitely getting better every generation, and that's the goal. But that was something that was not even talked about 20 years ago, right? So yeah, just having that as part of the conversation is good. And as far as like how we talk about diversity in our own homes, the way that we approach it in our house is, we just talk about different countries all over the world and how, yes, people have different hair color, eye color, skin color, and, people, who live closer to the equator have darker skin color because they have more melanin. People who live further away next to, the poles, lighter because their skin is trying to absorb as much sunlight because they don't get any sunlight up there. And, it's just from a science point of view. And, I think that just emphasizing, with male, female, and every race that anyone can do anything. And I think that just that message alone is very different from what we all grew up with, insofar as I think it wasn't talked about, right? I think that there's just more of an effort now to just talk about people who aren't like yourself. Whereas we didn't grow up with that in the 90s. I was, sorry, I'm a 90s kid. So yeah, I think every generation definitely, we're working on it slowly but surely.
Thanks, Dominic. Anyone else that kind of want to talk specifically about your community in terms of your social identities, your identities, whether you feel a part of, included, and how? I hear a voice, but I don't. Who is speaking?
I just unmuted. Maybe that was me.
Natalie? Okay.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, I was going to say, in our group, we talked a lot about parenting and motherhood, and a lot of us identified as a mom. I identified as a working mom, which means that I sort of intersect with a lot of folks in town a little bit differently. I think probably Weston leans more toward moms who are home or don't work full time. So that means sometimes I can feel left out. A lot of times I can't attend things like this. But also because I'm a mom, it makes it really easy for me to relate to a lot of folks, because I think motherhood is a shared experience with a lot of women. We can connect over, whereas my husband, who is doing a lot more childcare right now because he's working part-time, being like a dad in this community is a totally different context. And then in terms of like how our identities as like working parents impact how we talk about diversity, I thought it was, we do talk about diversity, like Dominic was mentioning, and of course, like in our family, we have an approach to it, but I hadn't thought about how it intersects with how I think of myself as a working parent. So that's something I need to consider more when talking to the kids.
Thank you.
Just sorry, Dr. Reynolds. Nicole, I think you mentioned to post our questions in the chat. Chat is disabled for participants, so you're not being silenced because we're not interested.
Okay, I get it.
Oh, interesting. All the technical ways to like stop our flow, right? But the good thing is the group, we could do this. This is fine. So yeah, so I see. So one of the ways in which you may or may not feel welcome has to do with whether you're a working mom or not. Because of your hours, you may not be able to participate in all of these. What about in terms of like culture or race or religion or some of the other kinds of identities?
I'm Anita Dinwiddie. We talked a little. Hi, I'm actually Guyanese as well. It's just a small world. So we talked about a little bit about moving here and the kind of like how we came from different cultures, and we had one woman that is Italian, and she it was very hard, different for her coming into a different culture, and then we had one woman that came from the South, and just her children speaking with a Southern accent, how they were viewed a little bit differently. And I talked a little bit about, being, moving here and, as I said, being Indo-Guyanese, and, I've been through biases in the past. I've definitely had some racism directed towards me and viewed differently. But my children are much lighter. So I found it very important to really be honest with like what you were saying before about really having open discussions with them about, what I've been through and what my reality has been, and try to help them kind of feel like they're in my shoes. So that was something I talked about and in the breakout session.
Thanks for sharing. My sister, right?
I know, right? Such a small world. I lived in New York City and didn't know any Guyanese people, and now I'm meeting so many.
There's a lot in New York. I don't know how you didn't meet them. Anyone else that wants to share, maybe in terms of perhaps how your own identity or intersection of identities could be playing a part in others not feeling part of the community? Does anyone want to be vulnerable enough to share?
Let's try.
Ashley.
So for me, I look, American. I look like a white American. I'm not. I'm Australian, and I spent my entire adult life in Japan. And that's a big part of my identity, but it's not visible. And if you don't know me, you don't really know that. My son was born in Japan. One of the things that came up in our conversation that really struck a chord with me is about, to your point, being vulnerable yourself. One of the participants sort of said, I deal with D&I at work, but I never kind of bring that to the conversation with my kids. I work in human rights, and I talk about a lot with my kids about racism, and I buy the books and what have you, but I don't relate it to my own life. And I think that's just a real learning for me already in this conversation. I don't have a good grounding in American history and race relations in the United States, but I could share. When I lived in Japan, I have been thrown out of a restaurant because I walked in and I was white, and that is a drop in the ocean compared to the microaggressions and a lifetime of that, maybe living in the United States, if you're a person of color, if you've experienced that. But maybe I could just share with my kids how that made me feel when it happened, and we could talk about, imagine that kind of thing happening to you every day, twice a day, people making assumptions about you all the time. And so I have had that experience of being in a minority. It's nothing like what people experience here, that, but just to be vulnerable and maybe, use that as a jumping point. Don't divorce my own self from the kids' experience, I think is a learning I've already.
Thank you, Ashley. And one more person.
I'll quickly say something. I came from Brooklyn prior to this, and this is a small community. We 1 or 2 or 3 degrees separated from each other, whether it's school or activities or things of the sort. But ironically, I have found it harder to engage in discussions about race or diversity, in this community. I find it actually easier to do it with folks and strangers and people I met in the dog park in Brooklyn. And so, there's sometimes personally my fear of being the angry Black man who, is yet again talking about race and diversity and things of this sort. I'm empowered to do it because I've got 2 girls who, I want to ensure that they know their culture and that they feel empowered and loved and supported and at home in this community, because they are asking the questions about race and things of the sort. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One more.
Jonelle, this is Maria Robotham. Sorry, my screen's not on. Hi, I just wanted to respond to Martin because I know him and we're on boards together. But I find that his passion and the way he speaks to all of us and talks about it, it starts the conversation, and I have to say, it makes me personally and those around us so much more comfortable talking about it, because I'm white, I'm American, my grandparents are off the boat from Italy and Europe, but I'm like your standard Christian white person. So I have friends of color. My kids are growing up with children of color, and we talk about it all the time and how important that is. And Martin talking about the conversation and bringing it up and showing his passion for it just makes us, and me in particular, that much more comfortable to be like, yeah, let's talk about this. Let's get this out there. Let's not be afraid to discuss it, because we shouldn't be. This is all very positive and exciting, and it's not something that we should be afraid to discuss. And I just wanted to, give Martin props for what he does.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Maria. I mean, it's, I'm touched. Thank you for sharing that. She's not canine. She looks different from that photo.
I am not canine.
Can I say something really, just before I forget?
Yes, yes.
How, Martin, like I don't want to be like the angry black man or whatever. I find that around here specifically, which is a cultural thing that Nick has actually, so my husband is from Western Massachusetts. He's like, I'm from farm country, like just a bunch of hicks and white trash. And I was born in a really small, like hunting cabin and, but he's like, yeah, what is it with around here? He's like, people don't talk. He's like, yeah, everyone's got this puritanical English influence still of like being clammed up, So Jonelle, when you were talking about, how people see me as sassy if I'm myself or act animated, like, I feel like it's crap, for lack of a better word, right? That like, that you can't have a personality, I guess, like that anybody, right? It's like not seem as like around here, right? Prim and proper, or, if somebody's from the South and has an accent, that now they're seen in a different way, like less intelligent, right? It's crap and it's elitist, right? And it's a negative part of the elitism in the some parts of the country, right? And I think it's just to be aware of that puritanical clammed up influence that is I think where it stems from still. I think it's like old money, like bullshit kind of veil that people try to put on to act, to give them self-worth or something. I'm still trying to figure it out, so excuse my crassness. But I think it's just interesting.
Dominic. Kathy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to submit one third circle that I feel like as I'm listening to this is becoming more and more apparent to me. There's the one circle that you said is how you see yourself and your primary characteristics. There's the second circle of what are the glaring visuals that people see about you. There's also this third circle about what you assume people are reading about you based on those circles or based on those physical characteristics. And sometimes I wish, having those air bubbles above your head would make things so much easier, because, Martin may think like, oh, I'm at the dog park and this one, or here in Weston, and it's predominantly white, and they're seeing me as an angry black male, or this woman as, a white mom. And meanwhile, the other person, and I'm not saying a lot of people might not think that, but I don't think it's the vast majority, or you just don't know until you've had this conversation, right? Because you might be thinking, wow, I like his hat, or isn't she a striking woman? Or isn't she, wasn't that a funny thing that she said? But sometimes I think we put too much, or not too much, but you have to be cautious of making assumptions of what the other person is thinking, as much as, be cognizant of what you are thinking. But I think it's important not to jump to conclusions about what the rest of the world is judging based on your appearance.
Right. So I'll respond to that, and then we'll get into the rest of the presentation, because I think so many of you sort of like touched on things that I'm going to be talking about. So perfect. So one thing, generally, when we think about that pie where you're talking about how others perceive you, you generally get to those traits based on experience, right? Because it's when you come into spaces, you see how people treat you, and you notice that there's a difference depending on which space you're in. So when I am in, spaces with a bunch of Caribbean people, my Blackness is not necessarily the predominant, right? The accent comes out and there's like, it's not like, oh my gosh, you're a foreigner. It's, oh my gosh, you're one of us. Which one of us, right? So the interactions sort of like vary. If I'm in, like I know if I'm in higher ed, because the culture in higher ed is to have a preference for those who have PhDs over those who do not. The way everyone interacts with people who have PhDs versus who do not, even though you might have more years of experience, varies. It's the kind of culture where that is known, right? And so some of those things, there's no guessing about it. It's obvious. It's more of the things where, because you've had some negative experiences with certain types of people, that oftentimes we come into those spaces expecting the same behavior, and we're not really allowing for unique experiences, right? We're coming prejudged, and we're assuming that because I've had negative experiences with white women, let's say, that the next time I bump into a white woman, I'm like, she's going to be XYZ. But the reality is, just because her skin is white does not mean that my interactions with her will be exactly the same. So again, you're right, Kathy, in the sense of, again, it's all about assumptions, right? It's often based on our experiences that have confirmed certain types of behavior, which is why it's so hard. It requires intentional work to undo, to mitigate the biases that we have, especially the ones that are unconscious, right? The explicit ones where we can tell each other about it, that one is easy, right? Because we can name it. It's the ones that are coming out that we're not necessarily paying attention to. So on that note, I will go back to sharing my screen, and hopefully, let's see, if I do. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so full screen. We'll hide faces. All right, so culture. I think some of that sort of like came up in our conversations already. Our culture plays a huge part in how we interact with the world, right? So you don't necessarily, just because you're from, even Connecticut has a culture. There are parts of Connecticut that has a culture that is different than other parts of Connecticut, as is evidenced by some of you talking about coming from different spaces within Connecticut and not necessarily feeling like you fit based on some of the established ways of being. So what is a culture? A shared pattern of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors that distinguishes one group from another. I think that, I've only been in Connecticut since 2014. And I have often heard people talk about, the New England culture. Because of course, coming from Oklahoma, where everyone was overly friendly and went above and beyond to make me feel welcome. And then I moved to Connecticut and I was like, why isn't anyone asking me how I am? And actually staying long enough to hear how I am, not just asking and moving on. Or showing me a level of warmth that I had got spoiled with in Oklahoma. Mind you, when I moved from New York to Oklahoma, when people would, stop their cars and wave at me to pass, I was like, why aren't you, like revving up your engine to run me down? Because that was in New York. You don't expect friendliness. It's sort of like mind your own business and get where you're going. So I moved into Oklahoma very suspicious, especially since I had all these people saying, why are you moving to Oklahoma? I still have people saying, why did you go to Oklahoma? And it's like, well, it's another part of our country. It's not like some foreign terrestrial, extraterrestrial place. So those sort of biases show up all the time. And sometimes you're not the one who's holding the bias. Other people are imposing it on you and sort of trying to put you in a box as to how you should respond. So cultural values, we all have them. The cultural values reveal your personal orientation to life, work, and relationships. This is how you prefer to go about life and work. Cultural values may reveal biases you have toward those who have values different than yours. However, they do not predict your ability to work across cultures. They do, however, provide insights about how to effectively work and lead across cultures. So I thought when I was doing my cultural competency training, one of the expectations was that we would do this cultural values assessment and use that as a tool to figure out some of the ways that we show up in spaces. So if you go to the website that was shared, I think by now everyone has had access to the website. It would be the cultural values handout if you scroll down just a bit. I'm just going to talk about like 3 of them or so. On the handout, it talks about culture. So you have the cultural values, the definition, and the potential bias that is likely to show up depending on which camp you're in. So we'll do these 2: individualism versus collectivism, low power distance versus high power distance, and I think one other. So if you fall into the individualism camp, right, there is an emphasis on individual goals and rights. I should also say that when I took this assessment, I was thinking in the context of working relationships. So my answer would have varied depending on if I was talking about family and friends in more informal settings. So if you're individualistic, some of the indicators that you're more on that end of the spectrum, there's a desire for personal autonomy or personal accountability. You say things like, I'll take care of this. Versus those who are on the other end, collectivistic. You know, there's an emphasis on group goals and personal relationships. And if you look where I fall, I'm almost off the scale on collectivism, which is interesting because I thought I would be more on the individualistic end of the spectrum. But I guess in terms of working relationships, I am not a lone ranger. So indicators for collectivism would be, you know, first consideration is impact on in-group. So impact on my team, impact on my department, etc. And people who are on this end of collectivism are likely to say things like, let me check with our team, right? So on one end, it's mostly making decisions that have to do with the individual, what makes sense for you, versus on the other end, you're thinking about how will decisions impact the team as a whole, as opposed to just myself. So if you're working with people who are individualistic, right, you have to allow for autonomy and recognize the importance of rapid decision making. Whereas if you're working with people who are collectivistic, right, you have to create time for consultation and consensus building. You have to recognize the importance of building lasting relationships. So when we think of those 2 ends of the spectrum, so someone who is on the individualism or individualistic end of the spectrum, they're likely to look at people who are at the other end as lacking personal initiative, right? Because they're always thinking about the group. On the flip side, those who are more on the collectivistic end of the spectrum are more likely to judge individualists as, you know, being perceived as a lone ranger. And again, right, that is just your lens. And you might have lots of people from within your culture, right? It doesn't necessarily mean a culture from another country. It could be the culture of your work environment in terms of how the culture that has been established in terms of how we function, what is ideal, will play a part in how you judge each other as colleagues, how you judge each other as parents, how you judge the teachers, etc. If we think about low power distance versus high power distance, so low power distance, there's an emphasis on equality, shared decision making. Whereas if you're on the high power distance and it's about emphasis on differences in status and expect superiors to make decisions, right? So indicators of low power distance would be freely voicing dissenting viewpoints to authority, saying things like, hey there, to someone more senior. Whereas on the flip side, if you're more on the high power distance, you want to know the chain of command. You say things like professor, madam, or doctor. So I will say when I first moved to this country, I was flabbergasted with the informality in which students were interacting with faculty. Because in our culture, there's a hierarchy, it's an expectation that you would have respect for adults. A lot of the culture is, do as I say, not as I do. There's not a lot of questioning of your parents and teachers. And depending on which community you live in, any adult sort of has the ability to discipline you. So of course, moving to this country, it was like, why are you sort of talking like your peers or equals? So of course, right, so if you're working with people who are low distance, you want to de-emphasize titles and formalities, question or challenge authority. But if you're working with people like myself, you need to follow the chain of command carefully, and you don't question authority, particularly in public. And this shows up a lot, you know, in terms of the working environment, and depending on the culture of the university, where you're only allowed to talk to professors, right? You have to say professor or doctor or whatever your title is. How does that show up in terms of your community, in terms of how you interact with teachers? What are your children? How do they refer to their teachers, right? How do they refer to other parents? Do you use first names, or do you have a title like Miss or Sir or whatever? Those are all ways in which some of this will show up. So if you're more on the high power distance end, you're more likely to see those who are on the low power distance end as being disrespectful or weak. And the flip side is that they're more likely to see people on my end as being passive, right? Because it seems as if they're just accepting whatever is coming to them. And then let's do universalism versus particularism. Let's see. So universalism, there's an emphasis on rules and standards that apply to everyone. So indicators for this group would be their preferred standardized systems. They say things like, that wouldn't be fair because we've never let anyone else do that. Versus for the particularism, you know, emphasis on specifics and unique standards based on relationships. So possible indicators are there's a preference for taking things case by case. And they'll likely say things like, in the light of the circumstances, we need to make an exception. So if you're a particularist and you're dealing with a universalist, right, you need to think about provide commitments in writing and make every effort to abide by them, and provide rational and advance warning for when circumstances require change. On the flip side, if you're a universalist dealing with a particularist, you need to demonstrate flexibility when possible, invest in relationships, and show the role of the context in informing decisions. So this is definitely going to show up depending on your role in the community. So if you are the PTO president, how you make decisions depending on where you fall in the spectrum will be viewed very differently depending on how the people that are making judgments are seeing from which lens. So if you're a universalist, you're likely to see those who are not, you may perceive them as showing favoritism. And the flip side, if you're a particularist or more on that end of the spectrum, you're more than likely to judge universalists as being inflexible, right? So those are some of the ways in which just our cultural values are playing a part in how we judge each other. And then in the handout, there's all the different kinds that you can go through, and perhaps it will help you as you're thinking through your interactions with people at work, with other parents, even with some of the teachers. And I thought I would share some of the cultural differences in parenting. Since we have people from other parts of the world, feel free to add to the list. So in Japan and Norway, there tends to be a focus on cultivating independence in children, whereas in Scandinavia or Scandinavian countries, there's more of a democratic relationship between parent and child. In Korea, there tends to be more of an focus on obedience. And of course, that's not just Korea. Many Asian countries have that. In Jewish tradition, there might be a focus on developing resourcefulness and resilience in children. Then if we go to Holland or the Netherlands, right, there might be more of an emphasis on regularly scheduled rest, food, and having a pleasant environment. If you go to Spain, there may be more of a focus on social and interpersonal aspects of child development, right? more of thinking in terms of having the children, regardless of their age, actively engage in family life. So if the family is together and doing things in the evening, even the babies and the toddlers are up and about and engaging, as opposed to in some cultures where, depending on the age, the bedtime could be as early as 7 p.m., 8 p.m., etc. In America, since we're in America, we generally know some of the, parenting expectations, but there tends to be a focus on, grooming our children to be successful. There's a focus on success and what that means. And then there's weird need to be happy all the time. There's not a lot of room for negative experiences. Some parents go above and beyond to sort of shield their children from negative experiences, which may or may not prepare them to function as, by the time they get to college, etc. There's the whole helicopter parenting. Being in a higher ed institution, we have parents who will be calling the university to make appointments for their children who are juniors and seniors, or trying to check in on like how to access resources for their kids. And it's sort of like, well, your children are young adults, and these are the things that they should be able to do for themselves, right? And so from this higher ed perspective, when parents get too involved, it's sort of like let your children be, right? How are you preparing them to be effective in making those decisions? And then I thought this one was interesting. Polynesian islands, it's common for toddlers and preschoolers to take care of younger children, including those who are not family. So imagine your toddlers, your preschoolers, those who have older children when they were younger. Imagine them taking care of a baby or someone younger. I feel like this would be the time where someone would call child services, right? CPS to come get your children. So again, depending on where you are in the world, whatever your cultural values are, that's going to impact how you parent, and then it's going to impact the culture that you're in, how they see those practices. So for example, there are going to be some parents who are permissive or lenient. There's not a lot of structure. The children are allowed to do pretty much what they want. The other end of that is authoritarian, which is a lot about rules and control, heavily structured. You'll hear things like, do as I say, not as I do. So I come from a very authoritarian culture. So it's the other end of the spectrum. And then somewhere in the middle, there's authoritative, where there's structure, there's warmth in ways that the parents interact with their children. It's a little bit more democratic. So there's a conversation happening with the child, not just do what I say because I said so. So depending on how you parent and, the structure that you create in your home, you're more than likely to judge other parents if they're not following the same structure. So I have this example that my brother and I always talk about. When we were much younger, we're 7 years apart. He's 7 years younger than I am. So we were much younger. And my mom's friend brought her nephew over. And, when we were little, my mom made a decision that she was not going to childproof the house. We would have to learn how to navigate all of those spaces in the house without breaking things, etc., which we managed to do just fine. So she was never embarrassed when she took us to other people's homes. However, her friend's nephew that came to our house did not have the same kind of training. And it was like a tornado had come through our house. And as the craziness sort of like intensified, my brother and I just sat quietly in the chair, observing our mother, waiting to see what she would do. And, for a period, she kept looking at the child, looking at her friend, looking at the child, looking at her friend. Needless to say, the young man, who is a grown man right now, was banned from coming to our house. So that was how my mother managed differences in parenting. It was like, if your kid cannot be managed in my house, don't bring them back. That is not necessarily ideal, but it certainly stood out to my brother and I in terms of how my mother managed other parents and how she judged other parents, right? There was no sort of leeway to think about, mental health issues, disabilities. There was none of that, because again, that wasn't necessarily something that was at the forefront of conversations in terms of parenting and disciplining. So, so those were some of the things that I grew up with culturally that to some extent had to unlearn as a clinician dealing with kids with all different backgrounds.
Dr. Reynolds?
Yes.
How first of all, I'm going to relocate to Holland because I like rest, food, and good environments. How do we override those kind of cultural DNA that falls on us? Because I mean, my father would probably and mother would probably turn over in their grave to see the long leash that I extend to my kids, and oftentimes I wonder whether am I doing things the right way, I judge myself based on those kind of cultural report cards that we've been given. So,
well, let me tell you, if your parents were still here, you would be surprised how they parent, how they act as grandparents to your children. Because a lot of my friends I have no children, so I just have lots of nieces and nephews, and a lot of the times, very strict parents all of a sudden are allowing their grandkids to ask a lot of whys. There's a lot more patience and so on. So I think part of it is they're tired and they're like, karma is a bitch, right? So you have to sort of deal with the bad behavior for your kids that you did to us. So I get to enjoy your children. I get to spoil them. For yourself, part of it is being intentional. So for example, Martin, that corporal punishment was an active part of our culture in school, in our homes, and neighbors, right? The people in the community, that saying, it takes a village to raise a kid or a child. They took it literally. So if an adult saw you misbehaving, they could punish you, right? And then they would complain to your parents, and then you'd get a second round of like whippings or whatever. I didn't experience a lot of those. I was a well-behaved child. I just had a problematic mouth. I was very rude. I always had like, why that doesn't make sense, right? So I mostly got slaps on my mouth. But because that was the culture that I was raised in, and that was normalized in every way, I think because that was what was happening. When I moved to the US, I have to say, I came with this judgmental lens because I would be on the train and I would see certain types of people with their children with no sort of like, their kids were doing all sorts of things. And my first instinct was, why don't they spank that child? Why don't they do X, Y, Z? Because that was the culture I was raised in, right? That was what was normal. However, once I got into my training and I started understanding that there are multiple ways to discipline your children, there's all these other factors that I didn't grow up knowing about, right? In terms of disabilities and mental health issues that can be playing a part in terms of why the child is acting out. And you can't just parent all of your children the exact same way. So the more I learned and the more I was exposed to parents using different strategies and seeing how effective it was, it took a while to not judge people who were not parenting how I was raised. It took some years, right? But there was some intentionality. My plan is to be a foster parent. So if I'm going to be a foster parent, and a lot of my research is in the foster care system, I cannot use corporal punishment anyway, right? So it's this intentional way of thinking about what are the other strategies, having conversations, reading more, talking to other parents who are using different strategies and being effective. So the longer you've done it, the harder it is, but you have to be intentional every day and be prepared for people from your community to judge you, because all of a sudden you fall into that category of, I see you've become Americanized with how you're parenting. And sometimes they say, I see you have adopted the white way of parenting, right? So depending on who you're interacting with, others may or may not accept the changes. So you have to keep that in mind. So you might be working to change for the better for yourself and for your family, but it doesn't mean everyone around you will be supportive. right? So keep that in mind as you're working towards being a better person. Not everyone's going to be excited for you. So I have two videos that I wanted to show. They're really, really short. And I'll put the link in the resources so that you can look at the full thing. Let's see.
I'm going to take you around the world in 18 minutes. My base of operations is in the US, but let's start at the other end of the map, in Kyoto, Japan, where I was living with a Japanese family while I was doing part of my dissertational research 15 years ago. I knew even then that I would encounter cultural differences and misunderstandings, but they popped up when I least expected it. On my first day, I went to a restaurant and I ordered a cup of green tea with sugar. After a pause, the waiter said, "One does not put sugar in green tea." "I know," I said, "I'm aware of this custom, but I really like my tea sweet." In response, he gave me an even more courteous version of the same explanation. "One does not put sugar in green tea." "I understand," I said, "that the Japanese do not put sugar in their green tea, but I'd like to put some sugar in my green tea." Surprised by my insistence, the waiter took up the issue with the manager. Pretty soon, a lengthy discussion ensued, and finally the manager came over to me and said, "I am very sorry, we do not have sugar." Well, since I couldn't have my tea the way I wanted it, I ordered a cup of coffee, which the waiter brought over promptly. Resting on the saucer were 2 packets of sugar. My failure to procure myself a cup of sweet green tea was not due to a simple misunderstanding. This was due to a fundamental difference in our ideas about choice. From my American perspective, when a paying customer makes a reasonable request based on her preferences, she has every right to have that request met. The American way, to quote Burger King, is to have it your way because, as Starbucks says, happiness is in your choices. But from the Japanese perspective, it's their duty to protect those who don't know any better. In this case, the ignorant gaijin for making the wrong choice. Let's face it, the way I wanted my tea was inappropriate according to cultural standards, and they were doing their best to help me save face.
Okay, and one more.
What was amazing with this is we're looking at the same pictures and we're using completely different words to describe it. And this is the challenge of working across borders. We've got different ideas of accepted and familiar. Here's what's accepted and familiar to me when I queue. I was raised in the UK. We are the world champions of queuing, waiting in line. And you know, aren't we? We're fantastic, yeah? You know, if you're waiting in line in a supermarket in the UK, so let's say there are 10 people waiting in line. And we're all getting a bit impatient, you know, because we're all waiting in line. And then they open a new cash register. Do you know what will happen in the UK? The first 4 people, they won't move, they'll stay in the queue. The next 6 people will move to the next cash register in more or less the same order. And they kind of check with each other. And if they open another cash register, the same will happen. It's like a formation dance. It's fantastic, yeah? Would the same happen in Norway? No. What would happen if they shout out in Norwegian, it's ledig kasse, which is available cash register? What happens? Everybody goes for it. It's first come, first served. Isn't that what's accepted and familiar? Now, the first time that happened to me, I was shocked. And I said some not very nice things about Norwegians. But, you know, you've got to dig a bit deeper to find out, why do Norwegians do that? Why are they running for that cash register? Why is it a free-for-all and first come, served? I think it's got to do with this. What? They say, this is the King of Norway on a train in 1973, that guy in the cap on the right. This is equality. And I think the queuing system in Norway is all about equality. First come, first served is about equality. And it's the ability to dig under the surface and find out what the underlying values are. That's how you know how to communicate with people. And this thing with equality is really important in Norway. It's the reason we're so laid back with each other. We don't bother with titles. We dress casually. It makes a fantastic business environment, actually. doesn't it? But sometimes this can take you a little bit by surprise. And in those situations where you feel uncomfortable or irritated, we have a tendency to jump to the negative conclusions rather than the positive conclusions, you know? And I mean, I travel all over the world, and I know you're not supposed to, this isn't an advertisement for the airlines, but it's Scandinavian Airlines, and it's Lufthansa, and it's Singapore Airlines. And everybody knows that Singapore Airlines has the best service. Why? Because they have a whole lot more hierarchy in their societies. And therefore, when they serve you, they serve you. And Singapore Airlines staff, I don't know if you've ever been on the Singapore Airlines flight, but you just from the moment they welcome you, they look like they're going to serve you, don't they? I mean, it's just the body language. It's like anything for you, sir. Now, if a Scandinavian Airlines person did this when you came on, yeah, exactly, you would get suspicious, wouldn't you? What's going on? Because it's not accepted or familiar. That's it, you know? This is what it's all about. So this is how we do it. And look at the space. Space is important. Nobody's touching. And if you go to somewhere like Finland, that space becomes even more. Can you see? Look at it. It's fantastic. And look at the way they queue in France. There's nothing like the way I'm used to queuing. And it's different every day. It's never the same. And in some cultures, you need a bit more motivation to stand in line. And this is my favorite one. This is fantastic. Look at this. Huh? Isn't that great? They're all different. We're all.
All right, I thought I would show you just, you know, how culture shows up in different ways, right? And exactly the same thing, and we make judgments, right, without understanding the lens in which people are coming into these environments. All right, so unconscious bias. Oh, I need to share. Right, so unpacking unconscious bias. So explicit bias, those are the attitudes and beliefs we have about another person or group on a conscious level, meaning we are aware of it, we can talk about it. But the unconscious or implicit bias, those are the unintended, subtle, subconscious thoughts that happen to all of us, all of the time. No one is exempt. So if you have a functioning brain, then you have unconscious biases. As long as your brain is working, as long as you're able to think, you have a bias. Well, multiple biases. So, you know, generally when we think of the intuitive thinking, those are sort of those automatic sort of thoughts that just rush to the forefront of our minds when we encounter different situations. Oftentimes they're influenced by past experience, the type of information we've been exposed to, what we have learned in the past. And those will impact the words that leave our mouth, will impact our behaviors. However, the goal is for us to move towards the rational way of thinking. So of course, those thoughts are going to come, but then the goal is to have a filter. So just because you've had some racist thoughts come to the forefront of your mind, just because, you know, there's some sexism or judgments on how someone is parenting or judgments on the type of car someone is driving or how someone is dressed, the way in which, you know, a child communicates with a parent, all of those things may come to the forefront of your mind, but it doesn't mean it has to leave your mouth. It doesn't mean you have to act on it. And in fact, the more practice you have, the more your rational responses will play a part in being that filter. So when we're thinking rational thoughts, we are conscious, we're slow, we're deliberate. We're paying attention to everything around us, and we're taking in new information. So perhaps when you've had interactions with mothers from a particular neighborhood or particular school, or perhaps you've heard stuff about a particular PTO, you know, and then you're for the first time engaging with them, you might have all those thoughts, all the gossip that you heard. But your rational way of thinking is to then get to know the person or persons for yourself. Pay attention for yourself. Is there information that's coming in that's contrary to what you've been told? It's contrary to what you have believed, right? So that's sort of like slowing down the process in how you're making judgments. The better you get at this, of course, it will take time, the better you will be in terms of interacting with others. So again, back to the website, there's a list of all the different types of unconscious bias and how they show up. But I want to focus on the two most common ones. There is affinity bias, which is where you warm up to people who are similar to you or who look like you. And that makes sense, right? We tend to be drawn to people who have things in common with us. Whereas confirmation bias, that's where you have a belief and then you're paying attention for evidence to confirm what you believe. And you ignore all the other evidence that is contradicting what you already believe, right? So if you have heard that a particular television show sucks because you went to the Rotten Tomatoes, etc., when you decide to watch the movie, you're paying attention to all the reasons why this movie sucks, as opposed to having an open mind and paying attention and coming to that conclusion on your own. And then we get into microaggressions, right? So we all have, biases, like I said, but microaggressions are the ones that tend to cause the most trouble, right? Because they're not overt. They're not the types of things that will hit you over the head. The person may not call you the N-word or, one of the terms, depending on the oppressed or marginalized group you're in. They may not use one of those terms, because depending on your circle, it may not be permitted. But they might say other things where the underlying meaning or the hidden message that they're sending to you has the same impact. So microaggressions, they're everyday, verbal, nonverbal, all of those slights and snobs and insults. They could be intentional, but many times they're unintentional. However, if you keep repeating it and keep doing it after you've gotten feedback, then it's no longer unintentional, right? You're doing it without a care of the consequences. So the hidden messages, what was the undertone to what was said, right? The goal is to invalidate the group identity or experiential reality of the target persons. So you're trying to tell someone, you're invalidating someone's, how they are sharing, how they have felt, right? And here's where we think about impact versus thinking about intention versus impact. Just because you didn't intend to do something, just because you felt like you had good intentions, that is not nearly as important as the impact. It's the impact, that's where you need to be paying attention to. The person's experience of how they have received what you may or may not have intended to do is what you need to focus on and repair, as opposed to making excuses about your own intentions. Right? Some of those hidden messages may demean on a personal level or a group level. They may threaten, relegate, or intimidate others to an inferior status or treatment. Oftentimes, microaggressions communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target people based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So examples of marginalized groups would include people of color, women, individuals from the LGBTQAI+ community, individuals with disabilities, if you're a religious minority, people with addictions, undocumented immigrants, or anything, maybe just being, from one particular place in the world or whatever, or you are, you have a criminal record. All of those things could play a part in terms of how people treat you. So here's an example of how a microaggression might show up. So, oh, is that your little brother? Oh, is that your son? What colleges have you applied to? Will you be the first person in your family to graduate from high school? Now notice, both are getting to trying to find out who is the baby. And both are trying to get to, are you going to college, essentially? But the way it's phrased and who it is asked has a very different impact, right? And the first one is saying, is that your little brother? The assumption is that perhaps is not if you were pregnant, especially with a girl with 2 pigtails and you're saying, is that your son, right? So those are some examples, and here's some more. What's your major? Are you the first person in your family to go to college? Again, assumptions. What's the underlying assumptions? Do you have any kids? How many kids do you have? What does your husband do? Is the father still in the picture? So imagine if someone is hearing these types of questions and these types of underlying messages on a regular basis. So the first time someone would have done that, you would have gotten annoyed and ignored them. But by the time it gets to like the 10th time, right, there's now a cumulative impact. Imagine the first time you're bitten by a mosquito, you know, you're like, annoying. But imagine after the 20th time, the impact, the way you respond will be more aggressive. Ted will be a little bit more over the top, because the person who would have said one of those things may have been the 10th or 50th person. So sometimes people tend to judge folks who are in these marginalized communities as overreacting, taking it too serious, you know, and it's like, well, your intention may have been, you may have been curious, but you have to also keep in mind, you're not the first person. So for example, for myself, when I first moved to this country, I had people ask me if my country was in the island of Jamaica. I had people ask me if I know Bob Marley. Mind you, I don't know what age they thought I was, that I would personally know Bob Marley. They asked questions about, did I smoke weed, right? Because there's assumptions that if you're a Jamaican, you smoke weed. Bob Marley smoked weed. So therefore, if you're from the Caribbean, you smoke weed. When I was in Oklahoma at the DMV, this gentleman decided that I guess he wanted to have a conversation with me. He said, where are you from? I hear an accent. And I said, I'm from South America. And he said, in Texas? And so after having some of those experiences where people ask me really dumb questions that could be solved by just Googling, I tend to, when I introduce myself, I will say Guyana in South America. I will sometimes add geographically South American, but culturally Caribbean. Depending on who I'm interacting with, I will preface or sort of like acknowledge the elephant in the room as a way to avoid some of the nonsensical questions that I receive. And of course, that's light compared to some of the other types of questions and assumptions that people make. So let's see. All right, let us now go do any questions or thoughts on that. If you go now to the website.
Dr. Reynolds?
Yes.
Is there, can you talk a little bit about how the notion of, I don't see color, you know,
color blindness
is a part of maybe a microaggression or things of that sort?
So oftentimes, many people have been socialized that if they see color and they acknowledge it, then that's a bad thing. So if you've been socialized that way, it's really hard for you to now switch and say, I see your color, because you've been socialized to think by saying it, by acknowledging it, that is bad. And it then makes you a bad person. So we also have to consider how people were socialized. The problem is, if you don't acknowledge my color, if you don't acknowledge what you can visibly see, then a part of my identity has now been dismissed or negated, right? So because you've been socialized one way, you think that acknowledging my color is a bad thing. But the reality is, acknowledging my color is accepting the full me, is seeing all of me. So when someone says, I don't see color, to me, I'm like, well, you are not allowing for differences. You're not allowing for nuances, right? You are not acknowledging all of me. So part of your work will be to unlearn some of the messaging attached to what it means to acknowledge difference, what it means to, I am Black. So to say that and to acknowledge that you see that I am Black is not a negative thing. It's a fact, right? It's a fact that I'm Black. For those who are in terms of race that is a little bit more ambiguous, you may not be able to tell, right? because some people it's more advantageous for them to pass for a different group, right? And so part of it is for yourself, the work is to unlearn how you've been socialized that acknowledging color is bad. And a lot of people who say they're colorblind and they don't see color, but they love everyone, they appreciate everyone. Well, part of loving and appreciating everyone is to acknowledge all of them, right? So if you have a child or you yourself have disabilities, for me to just acknowledge the so-called able part of you or the mentally well part of you and to ignore the fact that you have all these other things is to not accept and acknowledge you as a person, right? Your skin color, your abilities, your personality traits, all of those things play a part in terms of who you are as a whole. And so, you know, those are the things that we have to think about. So if you're one of those people who was socialized that acknowledging color, acknowledging difference is bad, the work that you do is to unlearn that. Some of you will be acknowledging color is bad, but I want to accept everyone. Well, you can't accept everyone if you don't acknowledge people in their wholeness, right? And that's some of the work that you would have to do. So when it comes out of your mouth, as you're teaching your children about difference, right? So someone talked about, I think it was Dominique, who was saying, you know, looking at different parts of the world and those who live closer to the equator versus further away, that has an influence on your skin color. Those are all parts of giving context, right? And acknowledging it. It's when we don't acknowledge. I could give an example of, you know, doing my clinical training in Oklahoma. And one of my clients, you know, was at the shelter, and white woman, and she said to me, I just want to warn you that my daughter may not, she might try to like clean your skin. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Because apparently her abuser, her husband, has a Black male friend who, you know, family friend, and the daughter, when she was very little, you know, would try to clean the Blackness off of his skin. So she assumed that her daughter would do the same to me, because in her mind, the daughter had not been exposed to enough non-whites to be able to not do that. But when the daughter saw me, she just came and ran up and hugged me. But there were all these other attachment issues, things that were happening, right? But it was very interesting for me that she thought it necessary to give me that warning, right? That was sort of like putting that out in the open. That was more about, well, why didn't you wait until perhaps your daughter would do that, right? And she didn't. So these things are the first time that she, you know, the daughter tried to clean the family friend's hand, that was the opportunity to have a conversation so that it wouldn't be repeated. And you would think that that was like some way, this was 2013, right? And when that had happened was like 2010. So it's not that far back in terms of our children showing up, right? What they have learned and seen. So you may not have directly taught your children about certain things, but they do act it out when they're amongst their friends and teachers and so on. So we need to be intentional about having these conversations so there's no shame in it. I remember even back in Oklahoma, there were the executive director of the crisis center that I worked with is Black, and then there was me. Everyone else was white. And so for new clients, sometimes they struggled with remembering your name because they only met you one time. So I remember telling the client, I said, when you get here, just say, my clinician is the Black one, right? Is the Black young lady, whatever. And she looked like she was about to lose her mind. I can't say that you're Black. And I said, well, I am Black. There are two of us here in this building. So if you say my clinician is the Black woman, it narrows it down to two of us, right? It'll be a lot easier for them to find me if you say that, as opposed to say, I don't know who my clinician is. So I think there's a lot of socialization that people have in their homes and their culture and their community. I also want you to keep in mind that sometimes it's reinforced because perhaps you try to have a conversation and people shut you down. And then you're like, well, it's not safe to talk about it. There's a lot of white people that I know that are afraid to engage in these conversations for fear of, right, the consequences. So we also have to create spaces. It's not just people of color, like Martin was saying, that by bringing up these conversations, he is being judged a certain way. But there are many of you who would want to have these conversations, but don't know if the space is safe enough for you to do so. And will there be grace for you to stumble as you're doing so, right? But if you build relationships, you're intentional about it, you do your work in terms of, right, do your research, read more, join groups of folks that are doing this kind of work, that are learning, that will empower you to have better conversations. And remember, it's a journey. So not because you've read a few books and you have a Black friend, the one Black friend, or you have a white person you have adopted, the one child of color, that does not mean that you don't have racist tendencies. It does not mean that you don't have biases. The worst thing you can do is identify, well, I have a Black friend, or I have a gay friend, or, you know, someone from within that community. That is not, just because you've interacted with some people from the marginalized group does not mean all of a sudden you are free of the bias. So be wary when you say that, because especially if you say that to a person of color about your one Black friend, or I have people in my family who are Black or Latino or whatever, that is not helpful. All that will do is upset people of color when you say that. Just like, you know, if you are, you know, like you have a partner who's an alcoholic and someone else, you know, and the experience that you're having in that journey doesn't mean you're an expert in alcoholism. You're a family member of someone who's an alcoholic, and you can talk to other people who have dealt with that. But it doesn't let you off the hook that you can have biases that were ingrained from your childhood, that was ingrained in your family. For some people, their family, no one has ever had a divorce. And you're about to get one. And you're sticking it out even though that person is beating you to a pulp, because you don't want the judgment that's coming from that. Because in your mind, it has been ingrained, no one in this family gets a divorce. And that is dictating what's happening with you, versus being able to take in this new information that perhaps it is okay to get a divorce if it's not safe, right? So this shows up in many different ways. Many times we don't even know that we've been socialized a certain way until it comes out, or until someone calls us out for it, right? So it's a journey. No one has arrived. It's an ongoing process. Just because I do this for a living does not mean I don't have biases, does not mean that I have to constantly and be paying attention to the thoughts that are coming up when I'm interacting with different people. You know, there's certain personality types and things that I know once I start to feel a certain type of reactivity, I know I'm being triggered and I know why, because it's connected back to something else, right? And so we have to be paying attention to those triggers. We have to be paying attention to how are people responding. Just because you might say something that's a microaggression, hugely inappropriate, just because people around you laugh with you, doesn't mean they're in agreement. There's uncomfortable laughter. And so if you said something to a person and someone says, you know, that is not helpful, actually that's offensive, you can then turn around and say, well, everyone else laughed. You know, lighten up. It's not that serious. How many times people have heard that and they're like, I was just joking, right? Because now you're focusing on your explanation, your intention. Well, I didn't mean that. I'm a good person. And it's like, well, I'm glad that you're a good person, but in this moment you have been offensive and you have affected me, right? And so sometimes we need to really switch the lens in which we're paying attention in these situations. What is the impact? Whether it was intentional or not, everyone has biases once your brain is functioning. And so when you go automatically, but I'm a good person, or that person is a good person or a good kid, and so we want to let them off the hook for certain types of behavior, that is not helpful, right? Because then you're sort of reinforcing some of the habits and behaviors that you're trying to break. So let's do an example. I'm just going to read it out. You can follow on the webpage and you can tell me like what's the underlying message. So let's see. Let's do a lesbian client in therapy reluctantly discloses her sexual orientation to a straight therapist by stating she is into women. The therapist indicates he is not shocked by this disclosure because he once had a client who was into dogs. So what do you think the underlying message is there?
That it's not a safe space to talk about for her, to talk about her sexuality with that therapist, because the therapist has equated her relationship interests with those of bestiality.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Same-sex attraction is abnormal, is deviant, right? That's the underlying message, right? So it wasn't said explicitly, but the underlying message is that one. Okay, let's do two more. A blind man reports that people often raise their voices when speaking to him. He responds by saying, "Please don't raise your voice. I can hear you perfectly well." What's the underlying message?
Because the person has one disability, they must have multiple disabilities.
Right. And so it's that a person with a disability is defined as lesser in all aspects of their physical and mental functioning, right? It's sort of like generalizable that you're less than. Let's see. A female physician, let me make sure I actually shared that one. An assertive female manager is labeled as a bitch, while her male counterpart is described as a forceful leader. Since this is a predominantly women group, I feel like many of you can answer or may have experienced this. So what is the underlying message?
That a woman who speaks freely and with assertion is basically a bitch.
Right. Yeah. So women should be passive, right? And allow men to be the decision makers. Does anyone have an example of maybe how a microaggression has shown up in your community? Without naming names and all of that, right? Just give the general situation.
I'm actually originally from the Midwest, and it's not uncommon for people, when I tell them I'm from the Midwest, to assume that I lived on a farm.
Oh.
And I did not live on a farm.
And kind of many farms.
What's that?
I said there's so many farms here in Connecticut, so it's interesting.
I know, but there's also an implication and a feeling that because I identify as having grown up in the Midwest, that I lived on a farm, and that there's like a hillbilly aspect as well that people will a lot of times kind of assume, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Others, thanks for sharing, Sharon. Anyone else wants to share some microaggressions that they experience or that you have done to someone else, and in reflecting, you realize it was a microaggression? Rashida. You're muted.
No problem. Okay, so when my kids were, my husband is white, so my kids are biracial. When my kids were little, I took them to school for the first time, and one of the other parents said, "Oh my goodness, they're so cute." Are you your nanny? Their nanny? What do you charge? You should get their mom to arrange a play date. Yeah, no, made them.
That's very common, right? That is very common when, especially the mother does not match the race of the children, that people assume that it can't possibly be mom.
Right, and it's like, well, what are they? They're humans.
Right. That's a good one, very common.
Thing happened to me. It's like, unless you're same race and exactly 35 years older than your kid. Because I would have people ask me, like, if I was their nanny, or other kids would be like, or, you know, oh, are you their babysitter? Or I'd have moms not talk to me because they thought I was a nanny. I was like, well, that's messed up. I'm still a person, can still talk to nannies. But yeah, so it's, yeah, unless you're look exactly like them and are exactly 35 years older than them. People.
Or you're, and you know, if you're like a person of color, a woman of color, they might assume that there's teen pregnancy, right? Like you're one, you know, this is one of your many kids that you've been popping out. So there's all of that. Any other kinds? Anyone brave enough to share how they may have perpetuated a microaggression?
I had an example that was told to me by one of my kids' babysitters, and she was really upset about it. She was a waitress at a party, and she's Hispanic, and one of the people at the party called for her, but used a completely different but Hispanic sounding name. So it was, she felt very sort of, you know, minimized by that. It was sort of, they hadn't bothered to learn a name. They just kind of just grabbed at a Hispanic name, you know, any Hispanic name, and kind of, you know, threw it out there. And yeah, that really upset her.
And expected her to respond, right? It was like, why aren't you responding to the name that I've made up for you?
I received from actually good friends in this community, you know, the following statement, and maybe you can give some thought as to why this is potentially a microaggression. Upon learning that I attended Harvard, they will say, wow, really? Good for you.
So there's multiple messages there, right? At least they didn't even come full out and say the full thought, right? About there might be some thought process, and well, how did you get there, right? Were you part of the, what's it called, affirmative action, right? So there's some videos that I think it was from Harvard the students made in terms of the questions people ask, and there's a lot of assumptions that if you're a minority and you go to an Ivy League school or you went to one, that you only got in based on affirmative action, right? Or some sort of like special case, not because of your merit, not because that you're smart or you earned the grades, etc. It's always some sort of excuse as to why you versus someone else. So it's kind of common, Martin. At least they didn't fully say their full thought process. They stopped at, you know, just enough to be nice, but their thought process probably extended way beyond that. Ruby Hedge.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just wanted to add, and maybe I'm always looking for the good in people, but when I'm an extroverted person, and so when I meet someone and they find out that I'm Indian, and in the past they'll say, oh, so does your mom wear a dot on her forehead? Or does your father wear a turban? Or do you cook a lot of curries? I personally don't take offense to that, because in my mind, they're trying to find commonality and some, you know, and then open up a conversation to then expand on. So when they ask me the question, you know, I'll answer them, but then it might lead to talking about something else. So my first reaction is never, oh, well, that was stereotypical for you to then say that.
Well, again, right, part of this is impact. So if in your own experience, those types of questions do not have a negative impact, you sort of turn it around into an opportunity for conversation, right? That is still an individual choice. Again, impact has to do with the person is the one who is going to tell you what the impact was. And again, you may have conversations with multiple Indian women, and there might be some like Ruby who will answer your question and a whole dialogue will ensue. There'll be another Indian woman who, is tired of these types of questions, and her response might be very abrasive. Right? And so because you don't know if someone's response is not positive, you don't jump to now putting them into an entirely different category of aggressive, blah, blah, blah. But it's an opportunity for you to maybe say, I noticed when I asked you that question that there was a negative response, and I'm not quite sure why. Can we talk a little bit? Can you tell me more? What was it about what I said that was offensive? Excuse me. Right? So it could be an opportunity for conversation, but oftentimes people don't want to do the extra step, right? They immediately go into the defensive mode of like, something's off with her, whatever, she's difficult, right? In the work environment, if you tend to be someone who is bringing to the forefront these types of issues, you oftentimes get labeled as difficult, right? As trouble. Casey.
I have a question. So these were two really great points, that we don't want to make assumptions about people based on their physical presentation or the way they speak or whatever. But then we also want to acknowledge that they may look different than me, or they may sound different from me. So then what would be an appropriate way to speak of that and break the ice and acknowledge our differences without being in some way judging or having it be, so, that question about Ruby, like, how can we ask about her heritage without, to become, I'm extroverted. So like, I want to find out where you're from and, so how do I do that without being in the wrong side of the conversation?
Well, I think there's a difference when you're genuinely curious and asking, right? It's also about the tone, right? And how you ask the question. So oftentimes you can tell if people are coming from a prejudged place of, so like the jumping, just because someone is Indian does not mean they know how to cook curry. It doesn't mean they like curry. It doesn't mean that they were raised by Indians. They appear Indian, but they could have been raised in an African country. They could have been raised in Japan or somewhere else in the world. And so you're making lots of assumptions, right? So a lot of the times, if people approach me and say, oh, I hear your accent, where are you from? I am not insulted, right? I'll jump in as an extrovert. I'm willing to have that conversation. That's very different of like, after I say that, and then they jump in with like, oh, so is that like in Jamaica? or if someone says, where you're from, this happens a lot to like Asian Americans, etc. When, you say from Idaho or California or Connecticut, and people are like, no, where are you from? No, I am from Connecticut, I'm from Idaho, I'm from California. So there's also this sort of like, you're not answering my question how I expect you to answer it. So there's gentle curiosity in how you ask the question, and if you have a relationship or not, right? You could talk about, so, like, which part of the country are you from? Tell me more about your culture, things like that are more sort of like general curious, as opposed to being pointed. To ask someone if, because they have Indian skin, if they like curry, or if they cook curry, you're already putting them in a box. Because I love curry. I grew up eating lots of Indian food from my culture. I had curry just yesterday. So people are not necessarily going to assume that I like curry because my skin is black. They might assume other things, right? So asking the question, paying attention to the nonverbals of how the person is responding, right? Read up on the culture, ask questions, but be curious. And if you slip up, apologize and ask more questions. Tell me more, like, what specifically did I say that was offensive? They might be willing to share with you. Other questions?
And I would add
Yeah.
some transcript to what was just asked. Maybe also kind of giving the person their respect. So Ruby, I value your opinion, and then ask the question. At least kind of show her that it's coming from a place of good intention as well. Though we know good intention can lead to bad outcomes. So.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, people, when I start talking, they go, oh, hey, because I'm the person with the Southern accent, they'll repeat back to me with a hick accent. Where are you from? And make these assumptions based on the way I speak that goes to, again, there's lots of things. And when I many years ago, I lived in Chicago, and it was the first time I'd ever been asked where I was from. And I would say, well, North Carolina. And they'd say, no, where are you from? Like, North Carolina, it was like, and they wanted me to say where my European ancestors came from so they could put me in a box of something that I had not been raised to be aware of. And so I found it annoying because I was like, I don't really know. We've been here a long time. Like, don't ask me to get, go back, because I don't affiliate in that way in any way. So, so I do, I walk in a world of white privilege, so I just have to pull on the few times that I felt truly made other. But I do know, as somebody who was raised to not see color, then how do and I know now I'm supposed to embrace the color. And so an example is, we had a book when my girls were little, it was about the many colors of us. And it was a book that was, at the time, it talked about how some people had rose-colored skin, or they had milk chocolate skin, or they had, and so my daughter, one day, we're walking across the parking lot going into dance, and she's like, look, Mom, that little girl's hot chocolate. And I just was like, was that a good thing that my daughter shouted that out, that she noted the difference? Or in my mind, it was like, oh dear God, please be quiet, because we don't want to show that we notice that she has this beautiful different color skin than we have. So it feels fraught right now to go forward in acknowledging differences and not being seen negatively for acknowledging the differences.
Right. Practice makes perfect, right? And the more you expose your children to difference, right? Taking them to different museums that focus on different cultures, right? You also help them with the language. Like my best friend, her daughter, who is Black, she would correct, because of course in the books, she's reading books from all different backgrounds, different skin tones, but she kept saying that, if she would see a white person, she would say that they're vanilla, because in some of the books that she was reading, that was the word that was used, right? And then it was a whole conversation about, degrees of skin tone, et cetera, et cetera. If they're little, it's fine. Like, no one should be insulted if a child says your skin tone is like hot chocolate, because hot chocolate, right? There's caramel, there's hot chocolate, there's all of that. But it's an opportunity to engage further, as opposed to like, let's shut down. And of course, you're not going to be walking around the place saying, well, there's a Black man, there's a Black woman, that's a Hispanic person, right? Like random and weird. That is not what I'm saying. But I think there's beauty in acknowledging the differences and being open to saying so. It really creates space for other people to be part of the conversation, so that people who are biracial, or there's some ambiguity in terms of their race, might be able to engage in that conversation, right? But where they're from, and just because someone's biracial doesn't mean that they identify with both races or the different races they're made up of. They might identify with the one that people see, because they were raised predominantly in a community where that particular ethnicity was sort of like strengthened, right? So we can't make assumptions. We will know more when we have conversation, when we build relationships, when we expose ourselves to more people from different backgrounds, right? The more we expose ourselves to get to know people, not just in, only when negative things are happening, but we're intentional about seeking out. So maybe, you're traveling to different countries. Maybe you are going to other communities and volunteering and getting involved. Maybe you're exposing your kids to, I don't know, all sorts of different things where they're seeing people of different colors. Like I grew up never really being in spaces where it was one race. It was like, so when I moved to New York, like I was used to that. The difference was now it was multicultural, different languages, different religions. And I would ask questions, right? You know, so tell me more, what does it mean? Because when I lived in Ghent, I had never known of atheist or agnostic. People believed in something, even if it was a rock, they believed in something. So it was like my first time moving to America, knowing that there were people who didn't believe in any kind of God or any kind of thing. So I would ask questions, right? But I would start with, well, here's how I was raised, and here's what I was exposed to. But this is a new concept for me, you know? And then it became a conversation as opposed to me putting a negative, like if you don't believe in God or any kind of God, then you're inherently bad, you know? Livia, you had your hand up and then Martin jumped in. Do you still have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say something, maybe it's, I don't know, it's a bit weird, but coming from a country where we don't have many differences, I mean, in Italy, when at least until, I would say 10 years ago, there were not many people with different color skin, because it's just what it is. I mean, we had a lot of immigrants influx in the recent years, but it wasn't like that when I grew up. So I was not used to deal with any of this. And when I come here, I immediately noticed, and in a way, I was scared sometimes to say something that was inappropriate, because simply I didn't know anything about it. And this prevented me many times to start saying things or start talking with people, because simply I was afraid to offend someone. My kids are much better than me because they are more exposed. They are growing up in this country, so they are educated even at school in this way. But I was thinking maybe all of this sometimes prevents people to have relationships or conversations simply because they don't want to, you know, offend the others. So it's something we should balance. And we should try to open conversation, not close conversations.
Agreed. Absolutely true. Many people, especially when it comes, you know, Martin keeps asking about how do we get more people to talk about race and these very difficult, triggering topics. And we have to acknowledge that many people are afraid to do so. What if I do ask a question or I say something and then I offend someone and then I become labeled as such and such, right? But doing anything that requires vulnerability is a risk. Right? If you're wanting to push yourself to the next level, right? Because if I've only been exposed to, you know, middle upper class people of, so you could, there might be diversity in the race, but the class, you're all above a certain level. Everyone is college educated, et cetera, more than likely, right? Your only exposure to people who've been poor or homeless, etc., might be based on what you learn in your classes, in your college classes, what you read in the newspapers, and all the negative stereotypes that are on the news. And you may have the tendency to say, why don't they just find a job? Why don't they da 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 da? But if you were to volunteer in places where you're exposed to people who are from a different social class, and you start to hear their stories, right? Some immediately, what will come to your awareness is some of the biases that you already had. Some of the thoughts that came from what you listened to on the news, came from, you know, some people, because they as individuals were able to work their way up the ladder. They started from nothing and I have a lot now. Then the expectation is everyone else should be able to do that. We do that all the time, right? We make judgments. If I was able to do it, then you should be able to do it. You have no excuse. But the more we expose ourselves to people with different stories, the more we realize that we do have a lot in common, even if there are obvious differences. But it's a risk. We have to be willing to try. And then, you know, the first time you try, someone would be like, oh my gosh, that's so offensive. That's a teachable moment, right? So you've learned something. And maybe you spend some time learning about color blindness, you learn about blind spots, you learn about stereotypes that exist for certain groups. Maybe you do some learning on microaggressions. There's so many videos that are available that talk about it. And you'll hear some of the examples shared today are not nuanced. They're not like unique experiences when it comes to microaggressions. It's very common. So if you've watched enough videos on microaggressions, listen to children talk about some of the microaggressions that they experience, teenagers, people from, you know, if you expose yourself enough just by sitting in front of your computer, some of these things you can avoid because it's available, right? So you don't, it will be a few missteps. But again, if you have relationship with people, then you can ask questions, right? Then there's room for some level of grace. But if you don't know people and you jump in, it's hard to be vulnerable with strangers. It really is. But if you're all from the community, then you could be intentional. It's about intention, it's about taking the risk and knowing I'm not always going to get it right, because we don't always get it right. There's no perfect parent. You screw up a lot sometimes. And you're like, it's amazing that my kids have even graduated from such and such. You're in a pandemic. Some of you, your kids are home. It's amazing that they're still alive and functioning, right? Some of you, it's amazing you still have a job because you've spent most of the time at work trying to help your kids with school and you're stressed out. There's no perfect person. We all make mistakes. We're all works in progress. But just because you're a work in progress, it does not give you the excuse to not do the work. It's not like, you know, decades ago where we didn't have the internet, where we didn't have access to lots of information. We have access to more information than we can possibly imagine. And so the responsibility is on you to do the work.
I mean, I would love to add to that, and amen to what you just said, Dr. Reynolds. I mean, a lot of us would hate to be labeled as racist, and I believe you're not. But to really be anti-racist, you've got to do the work and you've got to take the risk. I'm a firm believer that any question can be asked if it's done with some kind of compassion and dignity and maybe vulnerability. So you could say, I feel uncomfortable about this, and then, you know, ask your question.
And if you develop a culture where, you know, it's a back and forth, like I'm really doing some work on this. I read this or came across this video and I really don't understand why this is offensive. You know, for example, like when Ruby shared, right, from her perspective, the same thing that was said to her, it has happened multiple times, but how she deals with it is to answer the question. She's not offended. But maybe if someone asks the question in a different way, she would have a very different response. But you start having these conversations where you're like, I've done some of this research and there are a few things that I'm struggling to understand. I don't understand why this is offensive, especially if you spent your whole life where this was a thing. You can then ask someone from the community that you know to be like, I am struggling with this. Can you help me? Would you be open to helping me understand why this particular thing might be problematic? That's a very different thing as opposed to expecting the person of color, expecting, you know, someone who has disabilities or someone from the LGBTQ community to sort of teach you how to be better. You never ask someone from an oppressed group to teach you how not to be one of the isms. It is your responsibility to do the work, and they can come alongside you, but they should not be the main teachers. Other questions, other thoughts?
So we will take probably 2 more questions, Dr. Jonelle, and then we will wrap up. Thanks.
Other things that you're seeing, questions that you have maybe in terms of your own group that maybe you want to do better at? Or you've observed and you're like, Shauna, did you have your hand up or were you just moving? You're still muted.
Yes, I do have my hand up.
Okay.
And I feel the need to apologize in advance for this question, but I think it certainly relates to the discussion at hand. You know, as the political community has created such divide, and you are working in a university, I'm really interested to hear how you advise students to get along, to talk. I mean, we've certainly, I think everyone on this video has seen how it's created you know, a huge divide even within the community. And it's a very hard topic. Even seeing how our own children respond and take things to the next level in terms of hearing what is discussed at home and being very, you know, closed on that. And it's a really hard thing to navigate, because while we want our children to understand our point of view and to respect it, we also don't want to see them coming across in a way that's aggressive towards people that might have a different perspective or point of view. So it's quite a challenging moment, and certainly touches on racial inequality and all kinds of other issues. So I'd just be interested to have your point of view. And we've done so good staying away from politics, so I apologize, but would feel remiss if we didn't touch on it.
True. So I would say with students, because of the political climate, I feel like more liberal leaning people are more vocal and out there with where they stand. In a more liberal state or blue state, those who are, you know, were supporters of Donald Trump or Republican or whatever, tended not to be open to their beliefs, right? There were some who were clear that they had the bumper stickers and so on, but a lot of times they were not, I would say, openly sharing their beliefs. And one of the things that I always tell my students and people that I'm engaging with, never assume that people in the room all believe what you believe. Never assume, because people tend to assume that because some of the people I'm interacting with believe what I believe, that everyone does. And so a lot of the times I have conversations about how would you want other people to respond to you if you're the one that has a view that's different from them. If they think your view is offensive, right? Or you're part of this group that should be ostracized, how do you want others to respond to you? Right? How do you want people to treat you? What is it that you're expecting from other people? And a lot of times, students in particular have not even paused long enough to think about how they would want to be treated. The focus is on, right, how they should be allowed to do as they please, right? They should be allowed to air their thoughts and their offenses and so on. And I have found that engaging in those conversations where we're thinking about, I always say, if people are too much on the extreme where they're completely closed to hearing, different opinions, that's it, it's closed. No change is going to happen, because the only way for new information to enter is if there are openings. So if people are too on the extreme one way or the other and they're closed off, there's no point in trying to have dialogue with them, because it's wasted. I'm more interested, at least in my role, of paying attention to the people who they might be leaning one way or the other, but they're interested in understanding more. Of like, well, I don't understand why such and such believes this. I don't understand why such and such is acting this way. I don't know, those types of questions. A lot of the times our conversations are about, is it possible for you to listen openly to other people's experiences and acknowledge there's a whole other, there's family influences, right? There are cultural influences, there's religious influences, etc., that are playing a part in determining why people believe the things that they do. Likewise with you. And so sometimes understanding people's history can help us to understand why they're at the place they're at now. And you don't have to agree with someone else's views in order to be able to work with them. And so there are quite a few students who have found out through social media or whatever that the religious views of some of the students. And then they're in this spot of like, well, what do we do? And I was like, well, what has changed? You were interacting with them perfectly fine and getting along. You just now know about their political affiliation. Does that automatically make them a different person? Are people allowed to have different views? Do you agree with everything with all the people you're interacting with? And for me, it's just about having conversations. I don't waste time having conversations, people on any end of the spectrum that are closed. Because if you're closed off, there's nothing to talk about. It's the people in the middle, helping them to ask the questions. I want people to challenge themselves. I care less about your focus on the other person. It's really about you. Because how you treat other people is not necessarily a reflection of how you want to be treated. Many of us would want people to treat us one way, but we don't practice it in the other direction. And so a lot of times it's also about bringing to the forefront. I hear a lot of thoughts and voices and opinions on this area, but what about XYZ? Where's the fit? Do we all have to all agree? Are we now closing out outsiders? Are we now closing out people? Are we forming a cult? Are we forming an in-group that only certain people could be a part of? I think we really have to be cognizant of the types of things we're saying in our homes, the types of things we're practicing that are then showing up with our kids. If our kids don't see how we deal with conflict in a healthy way, if our kids don't see us being able to talk through difficult situations, it's kind of hard to then expect them to suddenly have these effective ways of communicating when they're interacting with other kids who have different views, right? Effective ways of communication are learned.
And so I just want to add.
Last question, because we're going to have to really wrap up. Yes, so you can go ahead and ask the last question.
Oh, thanks. Even something as simple, which I ended up growing to learn this in college because I wasn't brought up in a family that encouraged conversation of any kind. You know, just the, sorry, I have ADD.
Take your time.
Oh, the openness to, through a dialogue, right, regarding, I don't know, politics or cultures or something that you don't understand or don't know of, to know that it's okay to change your mind, like based on new information input, right? So if your kids grow up with a parent who's always like doubling down, oh, well, but still, like, right, we all know that person who we introduce a new fact that completely like breaks their argument, right? But whether it's science or historical, and then the person's like, well, but still, it's like, okay, but you know, whereas that's the kind of parent I had. And so now I've really made an effort to just acknowledge that, you know, you kind of insert that into your algorithm, right? And just know that it doesn't make you seem like a weak person to have introduced that new fact into your brain and kind of be like, oh, I never thought about it that way. Oh shit, all right, I guess I was wrong. Cool, thanks for teaching me, right? Like it's all perspective. And when people become defensive and like, oh no, I'm right, like I'm afraid to talk to somebody who might, you know, give me a new fact that, you know, is not in my echo chamber. It's, you know, or even just acknowledge that, like, you know, like you said, tapped on earlier, where people just have different upbringings and histories, right? And that all is very emotionally charged and lends into what people believe in politically, right? And it's all good. Like, you need different opinions and that diversity that comes with those different opinions and backgrounds, right? And it's all helpful.
And again, when we think about personal boundaries, just because having dialogue and all of that is good, but if you're not in a space where you can sort of have those types of conversations and so on, and just the mere presence of the person is very triggering, right? Because you are, the direct recipient of policies, etc. I'm not telling you to go and traumatize yourself and to get in to try to have conversations. There's still, sometimes we have to do our own work and do our own healing and get to a space where we could potentially have those conversations. But again, you have to know yourself. And for some people, you might have to start with talking with trusted others and come to terms with some of those sort of conversations before you try to engage in conversations with someone at the opposite end of the belief system, right? So don't just decide, oh my gosh, it's Tuesday. I have learned so much today, and I am going to go reach out to someone who has very different political beliefs than I am, that I know that I wanted to block on social media. I may have blocked on social media. I'm going to unblock them and try to have conversation. That might not work out well if you have not done some of the work beforehand, right? So never just launch into things without preparation. What's your motivation for doing it? Who is the person or persons or groups that you're trying to engage with? Have I done the work to prepare myself to engage in those types of conversations? Are the people I'm trying to engage with also willing to have the level of vulnerability that I'm coming into this space with? Everything you do, question your motivation for doing it. If it's just so you can have a checklist of like, I have done my DE&I work. I'm inclusive, right? I get along with all people from every population. If it's just so that you could put a sticker on your social media or to tell people, it's not going to last. If it's just to tell people, well, I've read these 20 books on how to be an ally, how to be anti-racist. And so now I will correct everyone that I come into contact with because I am now woke. Please. This work requires humility. The moment you suddenly become the expert because you've read a few books and so on, and you spend less time working on yourself and focusing on fixing other people, that in and of itself is another problem you have created. So I will stop there of like, your work in progress, get some people that you could do this work with and practice. Check your motivations, and remember, just because your intentions were good does not mean the impact will be received in the way you intended. Focus on the impact, repair the damage done there, and then move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jonelle Reynolds. This was very informative. I've been getting little text messages complimenting your great ability to share this type of knowledge to our community. So we want to really say thank you beyond words. Dr. Jonelle volunteered her time here this morning and has really given us a lot of tools, resources that we can start working with. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for staying on and listening and asking questions and making this engaging. This is a recorded workshop speaker series, and so we will be happy to share it with everyone amazingly. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.